welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. The focus this week is on the turmoil, the turbulence in Afghanistan. Even as we speak, it is possible that Kabul may fall. Kabul may fall to the Taliban. If so, what does this mean? First of all, for the people of Afghanistan. Secondly, for the region. Thirdly, for all the external interlocutors who have been engaged with Afghanistan since the enormity of 9/11, September 2001. There are many strands, and embedded in this is also what happens to the women of Afghanistan in the event that the Taliban is in the driver's seat. And what about India and India's own stake, considering that India has made a fairly sustained investment as far as the socio-economic development of Afghanistan is concerned. To discuss all of this and more, I'm very glad that we have one of India's most accomplished journalists with us, Ms. Suhasini Haider. Suhasini is currently the diplomatic editor of The Hindu. She's also a reporter in the traditional sense of the term. And from what I can recall, it's been more than 2 decades that she's been on the beat. Brings a very high level of professional integrity to what she's done. And may I also add with a straight face that Suhasini is a rock star, particularly on social media. I'm very glad, Suhasini, that you could join us.
Thank you.
And to set the ball rolling, as I said, the news seems to be sort of moving literally hour by hour. Kabul may fall. How did all of this happen so suddenly?
Well, I think there are many parts to it, but looking at the dramatic developments, the takeover of provinces, then the provincial capital, major cities, our border checkposts, it does seem as if, to begin with, that the ANDSF, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, have not been as trained or well equipped as one had hoped they would be while the American and the NATO troops planned their pullout. That seems to be up there. Also, the lack of a proper air force, enough trained pilots that could have stopped the Taliban from coming in. And we know that morale in the forces has also been much lower because of the US pullout, because it happened, that also came very suddenly. And then if you remember, the US pullout from the Bagram Air Base happened overnight. They barely handed over charge, or some say they didn't hand over the charge to the Afghan commanders. We've also seen that in many places, local officials, governors, warlords who were expected to have held their ground have instead made some kind of a deal with the Taliban, either left before the Taliban arrived or got into a kind of deal with them. This might even be tactical, because after all, once the Taliban walks into a space, and we haven't seen them face that much pushback and fighting, once they walk into the space, holding that space is always more difficult. So we need to see how that will go. And finally, I will say that the Taliban, unlike governments and responsible actors, are essentially a terrorist organization that is making these gains. So what we're seeing is one group of the Taliban in Doha continues to engage the international community, continues to talk about peace talks, power sharing arrangements in Afghanistan and all the rest, while the Taliban soldiers on the ground are making these gains, are executing soldiers, are carrying out a sort of brutal takeover of the country by violence. So because they haven't had to really adhere to the norms that other armies do, the Taliban has been able to do this without keeping any of its promises. They haven't worked towards a ceasefire. They have not ensured that prisoners who were released by the Ghani government did not rejoin the war on the ground. They have not cut links with groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and we understand Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed have bases there as well. So the only commitment they actually kept was, again, a tactical one, that no US forces were attacked in this last year since they brokered that deal with the United States. So I think what we're seeing is essentially all of these factors come together very quickly. And while the Ghani government continues to say they will hold their ground, as you pointed out, Kabul itself seems to be under threat.
But I'm glad that you were quite unambiguous in describing the Taliban as a terrorist organization. And all their actions, not just now in the last 2 weeks, ever since they've made these tactical gains, but over the last 20 years, I don't think they have given up the ideology of terror. So when we look at the short term, the next year or two, it appears that all the major powers are coming to terms, and whether it is cynical or opportunistic, they are now beginning to accept the Taliban as an entity that will be in Afghanistan and that they have to deal with it. I mean, leading the list is China. Now, after the US withdrawal, it appears, again, one is not quite sure about the fine print, that the US is engaging with Pakistan to see what kind of a modus vivendi is possible in Afghanistan. And we have Russia, also I've been keeping a very close eye. So before I come to India, and if I recall right, you were in Central Asia recently for the connectivity conference. The Central Asian states are also, I would say, relevant players, even if they are not big players. So when you look at the external interlocutors, does it appear that all of them are now preparing to sup with the Taliban?
Well, that is actually one of the conclusions that one is drawing, that while India has still not resolved its question of whether it will engage the Taliban openly or not, we understand security officials have been in touch. And just this week, for the very first time, an MEA delegation sat in Doha with a few other countries and spoke to both representatives of the Taliban, the Afghan government, as well as the United Nations, hosted by the Qataris. Despite those furtive attempts, India has possibly been the last to this endeavor to mainstream the Taliban, if you like. So in that, and if you look at in a sense, the discussions that have been held over the future of Afghanistan, the fact is there is one intra-Afghan negotiation that is going on, but it is on and off. It depends on the Taliban's mood at the time, and it hasn't really made progress when it comes to the important issues: ceasefire, constitution, what is the future of Afghanistan going to look like? Will it be a democracy, and all the rest of that? Where we have seen the maximum amount of movement is in a mechanism called the Troika Plus. They've met 6 times in the last 2 years, and it's US, Russia, China, and Pakistan. Essentially, US, Russia, and China as the 3 global players, if you like, in Afghanistan. And they are connecting with Pakistan, whom they see as the country with the maximum leverage over the Taliban. So in a sense, it's a cynical kind of effort, which is far removed from the ideas and the ideals of an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led solution. What this group has essentially decided is that the Taliban will be engaged with, despite the fact that it has not accepted a ceasefire, despite the fact that the killings continue, and despite the fact that it hasn't even kept its promises to the United States, whom it signed an agreement with. The engagement has continued. Pakistan has been leaned on and propitiated at various times in order to ensure that the Taliban comes to the talking table for the simple reason that they want to be able to see that when the US pulls out all its troops, that there is some kind of a power sharing arrangement. Clearly, the Taliban has gotten ahead of this idea. They are taking territories even before the US finishes its pullout on August 31st. It is likely that they will hold off taking Kabul, possible, not likely, but possible that they will hold off taking Kabul until they are able to work out some kind of a power sharing surrender arrangement with the Ghani government. But what was planned by these global powers dealing with Pakistan was essentially a very cynical arrangement, if you like. And you see how quickly it all falls apart when the United States, that has been the driver of this process, that has been constantly saying, we need to pull out, we are going to send a special envoy who's going to, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, who's going to bring together everybody. when even the United States is in a situation today when, in order to pull out its last 3,000 Americans, personnel, and civilians, they need to send 3,000 more troops in to ensure their safety. It clearly means that somewhere or the other, everyone's plans have gone awry, but the international community, or certainly the global players over here, have not changed that position of continuing to engage the Taliban, even as it breaks all its promises on the ground and continues on its advances to Kabul.
Suhasini, it's actually a very sad conclusion that when you recall, the genesis of the current Afghan problem, because Afghanistan has been the equivalent of a very, very difficult arena for centuries. I mean, the phrase graveyard of empires has often been used in relation to Afghanistan. But the modern problem, when we talk about September 2001, 9/11, at that time, I think the way in which the United States was attacked, New York City, the Pentagon, and so on, I often say that it was inevitable. The United States had to act militarily. Yes, after attacking Afghanistan, I think they lost the plot and they went off into Iraq and various other things happened, which led to, frankly, this complete mess. But at the end of the day, I think we also have to remember that India was one of the beneficiaries of the US military action in 2001. When you recall what happened in 1999 December with the Indian Airlines plane being hijacked, the late Mr. Jaswant Singh as foreign minister having to negotiate the surrender. And we remember the attack on the Indian parliament and all the terror events in J&K at that time. It's only after the US action that the Taliban was ousted from Kabul. But today, if you say, what did the United States actually win or gain? And this is actually a question from one of our members on security analysis. They said, please ask Ms. Haider this question. What did the US either win or gain after expending $2 trillion, so many lives lost, so many soldiers injured for life, perhaps, that whole trauma. And Afghanistan, it's been bombed into God knows which century. So there are no winners really. So how do you look at it? I mean, this is rather a sad question to ask you.
Well, I think those questions could be asked of other US interventions as well, not just Afghanistan, going back to Vietnam, but then in more recent history in Iraq 1, Iraq 2, Libya as well. The idea that the US has lost as much in terms of what it has gained in each of these interventions. And yet we do know that the US went into Afghanistan with the idea perhaps of revenge for 9/11, but also an idea to clean out the terrorist safe haven that Afghanistan had become, and that had become a threat for us as well, as you pointed out. And the ungoverned spaces of Afghanistan to try and build a democracy there. And they were to a large extent able to achieve that because they did see a democracy. They did see 3 elections in Afghanistan, regardless of how successful you think they were. They did see the per capita incomes of Afghans grow. We have seen development in Afghan cities. We have seen all kinds of freedoms that Afghan women, Afghan children, Afghan minorities did not have under the Taliban regime and had not had even prior to that. We saw that come out. Women in the top institutions, in parliament, in the negotiating teams as well. So we did see them make these gains. However, I will make the point that for the last few years, everything the United States has done has in fact erased the gains that the US could have walked away with. In other words, if the US's plan was to leave once Afghanistan was settled on the path to democracy, then the time to leave was a decade ago. And to not then interfere in elections as they did, and to the outcomes of those elections as well. If the plan was to make sure the Taliban could not come back to power, then perhaps even then they could have left some years ago. What essentially the US did was stay on long enough so it forgot its own promises of why it had reached there. And when you look at the fact that in 2001, the US put all these Taliban Taliban leaders on their list of UN Security Council designated terrorists. And 20 years later, they were not only having them taken off the list, they were telling other countries, these people are no longer terrorists, please engage with them, practically paving the way for them to come into a power sharing arrangement in Kabul. I think that is where the US has probably faltered. When you look at the other two global players, Russia and China, who are now closer today than ever before, clearly they see the US pull out as something that benefits them. It increases their sphere of influence. And if I was to look at it in a different way, I would say if Russia represents the past, that have faced these problems in Afghanistan. The US faces the present. China is being seen as the future, because after all, China has also shown its interest in trying to ensure that there is no terrorism in Afghanistan that affects China in Xinjiang and also in Pakistan. China has decided to link its China-Pakistan economic corridor with the Trans-Afghanistan Railroad and the Belt and Road Initiative. And China has become a very important player when it comes to what happens in the future of Afghanistan, the resources of Afghanistan, where they will go. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier, none of the three of them are yet thinking about the Afghans themselves and what they have gained in these 20 years and what they stand to lose in just a matter of months because of the strange kind of turn of events of the last couple of years and the way that the Taliban has been brought back into the mainstream, the way the US has hastened its pullout from Afghanistan to the point where today US President Biden says the Afghans have to fend for themselves. You see that the roots and the causes of the problems may not be that far behind. They may just be the last few years and the manner of the exit of the United States.
Actually, this allows me to enter this particular area, which is when you talk about the Afghan people, for decades, they've lived with the gun. They've also lived in what is loosely described as the opium economy. So it's the gun on one hand, drugs on the other. And more often than not, the victims of this kind of oppression have been the women of Afghanistan. So when you look at the near future, how do you envision? Because let's face it, some of the external stakeholders also had a very direct interest in the opium economy. The drug lords were not independent players. They had linkages with each or some of the principal external interlocutors, and all the intelligence agencies, I think, have their own assessment about who's been benefiting from the drug trade while ostensibly trying to protect the Afghans from the Taliban. So it's very murky. So how do you see these three sort of strands? One is drugs. The other is the terrorism related to guns. I mean, there's a proliferation of small arms, light weapons, and when the Americans retreat, there'll be more heavy ordnance, which is going to be available there. And what does this do to the hapless Afghan citizens?
Absolutely, and I think you're pointing to three of the real worries for the future of Afghanistan, because after all, the drugs basically come through from two provinces, I think, in Zaranj and in Helmand and in Farah provinces. And these are areas that have now come back under the control of the Taliban, which even in the past was happy to allow that trade to continue because it had no links with the international community, because the international aid was not coming into Afghanistan. They would use these instead to spread opium and heroin trades around the world, in fact. This is going to straight away impact if the Taliban comes back into positions of power everywhere. The second part, as you said, is one of violence and guns, an entire culture that one had hoped had been, at least, if nothing else, an option had been given to it. Because after all, if you were born in the year 2001 in Afghanistan, today you would be nearly a major, you would be a 21-year-old. And you would have had the option in your lifetime to have seen a different Afghanistan, to have gone through an education, at least in many of the cities and most of the provincial capitals. You would have had your education. You would have got the idea that there were new jobs opening up, that there were new vocations happening. I remember one of the visits I made was to Kandahar, where India and Afghanistan had together actually built an agricultural college for women. It was right next to the Kandahar Agricultural College for men, and there was now an agricultural college for women to teach them how to be more efficient in their agriculture. The irony of that situation was that it was built on exactly the same place where the Taliban once had a headquarter and had been training people, and it was said that even people like Bin Laden had visited. So on that same area, they had built these new opportunities for the Afghan youth. And the fear is that if the Taliban decides, to take many areas by violence, which will no doubt lead to a counterattack. I have no doubt that the contestation will continue because the Taliban has not shown any desire to rule Afghanistan through a democracy or to stand for election. They had the option to do it even before. They have not shown any desire. All they say is that we are actually the most popular people in Afghanistan. But if we are not going to see a democratic republic Afghanistan that we had seen the seeds of being planted over the last 20 years, then all of that combines to really make the future of Afghanistan something to worry about. And I would like to say that, India has had this very positive role over there in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, and that as well is in jeopardy today.
I think that's actually, again, one of those ironies about the current situation, because on the few occasions that one had visited Afghanistan, clearly, I think there was a lot of goodwill for whatever India had done in the last 2 decades. And that was building on what I would call as a traditional kind of empathy for the Afghan citizen and whatever they had imagined or whatever they thought about India. And of course, we have this in many ways for a whole generation. It was enshrined in that famous story, Kabuliwala, which I think many of our generation would remember. But now I think this is the most relevant part, that for India, with this kind of turmoil, turbulence, and the fact that the Taliban is likely to be in the driver's seat very soon, how would India's own strategic interests be impacted? And I'll tell you why I'm raising this, because there seems to be a kind of received wisdom that the Taliban is a proxy for Pakistan. Pakistan is a proxy for China. China bears nothing but, at this point, ill will for India. And therefore, in the long term, India is going to be dealing with a very complex, layered challenge come threat. The Taliban threat we saw at the turn of the century. Pakistan is something that India has been dealing with for decades in terms of state-sponsored terrorism. And I think China, we have 2 bookends, 1962 and Galwan. So with all of this, has India been isolated? Or do you think that there are some options that India could still review and invest in if the Taliban is the only entity in Kabul very soon?
Very quickly, before I answer that question, because yes, I do think India's strategic calculations have become much more complicated. When you mentioned the Kabuliwala, I do want to point out that for the last 20 years, what has been the Indian interface with Afghanistan? When it comes to Indians in Afghanistan, they have been seen as the people who built the parliament, or built the Salma Dam, or built the Zaranj-Dilaram highway, or built check dams in schools and other urban projects. What has been the interface of Afghans in India? It is not the Kabuliwala anymore. It is the youth. Yeah. It is those who come to study in India, those who come to train in India, those who come to our military institutions as well. And it has been a whole new generation. It's young politicians who have been educated in India, in institutions like where you've been as well. And it is actually something that needs to be preserved. I'm not sure how that is possible, but it's something that needs to be at least acknowledged as a change in the last 2 decades. When it comes to India's strategic calculations, you put your finger on it. India has a situation to its eastern frontier with China at the LAC, western frontier at the LOC with Pakistan. One more unfriendly neighbor unfriendly government in the neighborhood is obviously going to be very difficult, particularly as you pointed out, given the past of the Taliban when it was in Kabul and the IC-814 hijacking and all of that. But there are so many more things to worry about as well. And I mean, the immediate worries are for Indian citizens. And I think in the last year, we've seen India shut down its missions in Jalalabad and Herat, now in Kandahar, and then in Mazar-e-Sharif as well. So just the Kabul mission is open for the moment. We don't know when the others are going to open. We are going to have to brace for some kind of refugee influx, although they will go around the world. We've already seen the MEA speak specifically about bringing members of the Sikh and Hindu community here, but there will be others who will need to be given shelter as well. We are also going to have to see what the Taliban in power means, as I said, for ungoverned spaces. Groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which now get more space to carry out attacks against India. Then there is the larger worry, and you mentioned Uzbekistan and Central Asian countries that are immediately impacted by what happens in Afghanistan and where their choices are as well. One of the big worries is the spread of radicalization, not just the kind of radicalization that we saw perhaps when the Taliban first came to power in 1996, but also after the kind of radicalization we've seen in the pullout of the US from Iraq, which led again to the Islamic State. The worry about fighters moving across the borders very easily, and of course for India in particular, the larger worry of the Pakistani military having control of and sway in Kabul. That finally will lead to the other big problem for India and its plans for connectivity in the region. Because India's plans for connectivity in the region really hinged on subverting Pakistan or bypassing Pakistan. One of the big projects was the Chabahar project in Iran. The question now, will the Taliban government pursue that option at all? Will the Taliban government prefer to do any kind of trade with India, or will all trade pass through Karachi and Gwadar? We're already seeing countries like Uzbekistan now doing transit trade agreements with Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the idea that, as you said, Pakistan has leverage over the Taliban, China has leverage over Pakistan. China, as I said, is already making these connectivity routes. The US has started a new quadrilateral called the US, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan quadrilateral, again with the same idea. And they've already run truck convoys going through Karachi, Gwadar, all the way to Tashkent, also to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. So we're seeing each of these countries putting some of their eggs in this basket with the idea that if the Taliban does come to power, they will, in this new environment, probably engage with the Taliban. They will not do what the world did to the Taliban in 1996, when only the UAE, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia really recognized them. This time, other countries are already engaging with these Taliban leaders. So they are shoring up their connectivity, their trade through this region, through Pakistan, and not through India's options when it comes to dealing with India or dealing through Iran with Chabahar. So there is a lot more in terms of India's strategic stakes at play right now. And honestly speaking, there are very few good options ahead for India, because India could stick to its principles, stand by the Ghani government. It could even supply military ammunition to the Ghani government or to the NDSF via, say, an Iranian route or something else. It could, on the other hand, accelerate its contacts with the Taliban, but as I said, it would be the last regional country to do so. And it could simply sit, wait, and watch. But that brings with it a certain amount of irrelevance. So all of India's options right now are complicated, and they're complicated by the idea that this outcome is possibly the worst possible outcome for India.
I know we are sort of running out of time, but I cannot help but ask this question, which is that when you look at the larger geopolitics of the Islamic world, whatever is happening in Afghanistan now, and in Kabul in particular, how would this sort of impact whatever be the long-term interests, both political and theological, as far as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, because Turkey also is now a player of relevance as far as Afghanistan is concerned. So briefly, geopolitics and theology when it comes to the Islamic world.
I think you've already seen that these countries have already worked their inroads into Afghanistan, both with the current government as well as with the Taliban already. Iran, despite being inimical to the Taliban, has actually hosted many rounds of talks, although they have stayed out of that Doha process so far. But they have hosted many talks with the Taliban because they understand as a neighbor what happens in Herat is going to affect Iran as well. And I think you're seeing the same. Turkey, for example, has proposed to take over all the security for Kabul, or at least for the Kabul International Airport for the moment. Saudi Arabia continues its links, its traditional links with all of them. When it comes to the theological factor, I think we're moving into a new phase now. Where geopolitical differences are overtaking what you might have earlier seen as the Sunni-Shia arc, or you might have seen the clash between countries in that respect. Instead, what we are seeing is new formations come, particularly with the opening of West Asian countries, UAE, Morocco, and other countries to Israel. We're also seeing Turkey looking at setting up a kind of parallel to the OIC in a certain sense, and building its own links, whether it is with Qatar, whether it is with Iran and other countries. So I think what you're seeing is geopolitical differences are going to come to the fore. Afghanistan hopefully will not become yet again a victim to another level of that great game being played out. I think what is also important to see is where the Biden administration goes finally with the Iran JCPOA agreement and all the rest of that, because so much hinges on that when it comes to Afghanistan as well. The US sanctions on Iran, is there going to be a difference in that as well? I think for each of these now in this increasingly globalized world where India has played such a big role, that each of these decisions are going to impact India directly as well. And there's no way to guarantee or to insulate India from what happens in Afghanistan today.
Thanks so much, Suhasini, because it's very sad when you look back at Afghanistan, as I said, whether it's over the last 50 years, beginning with the Soviet invasion during the Cold War, and what happened in Afghanistan then, and the rise of the Mujahideen, and subsequently the events of the 90s when we had the Taliban coming center stage. And then post 9/11 to where we are now, which is really the return of the Taliban. I think what the short term holds is bleak. One wishes that it could have been different because there were some windows clearly, but they were not harnessed in the appropriate manner. And at the end of the day, I think, as our little chat had suggested, it is really the hapless Afghan citizen who wants to get on with his or her life. And each time there is a geopolitical convulsion with very tragic consequences. And one hopes that India would be able to find an optimum path, but that's a big, big question mark at this point. On that note, let me thank our guest, Ms. Suhasini Haider, for spending her time with us, and in a very lucid way, I think, outlining what lies ahead. Thank you for watching Security Analysis. We'll be back next week with another program. Jai Hind.